She hid a bleeding Mafia boss from the police and saved his life. 2 years ago, Nurse Emma Sinclair pulled 3 bullets out of Dante Russo and forged his medical charts. He left his mother's ring under her pillow as a promise. Now, her life is in ruins after a brutal public breakup. When she finally returns the ring to collect her debt, Dante's actions is bone-chilling. "I will teach you to become strong," he whispers. But stepping into his world makes her the ultimate target. Let us examine the subject Emma standing outside the Obsidian Club. Her tremors stem from acute cortisol flooding her system, not the freezing November wind. She is 27, a clinical nurse, gripping a velvet box in her pocket like a talisman. This location operates as a sanctuary for antisocial personalities funded by untraceable wealth. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case together, observing how a rational professional initiates her own psychological unraveling by stepping into the domain of an apex predator. Sometimes, the most severe behavioral anomalies occur when a shattered mind willingly walks into the fire. Growth demands that we confront our deepest fears. Though her choice will alter her reality permanently, let us see if she survives the night. As the subject crosses the threshold, the environmental stimuli immediately shift. The architecture is deliberately designed to project unchecked dominance. Enormous chandeliers illuminate dark burgundy booths, while perimeter guards exhibit the flattened effect typical of seasoned enforcers. In the amber lighting, sociopathic individuals conduct transactions that dwarf a civilian salary. Before Emma can process the sensory overload, a hostess named Bianca intercepts her. The woman deploys a highly calculated, superficial smile to assert control, calmly explaining the facility is strictly for members. Yet, her pupillary response remains utterly dead. Remember this simple truth for your own life. The most dangerous traps are always disguised by the sweetest, most welcoming smiles. Emma suppresses her flight response, anchoring her feet to the marble. She informs the gatekeeper that she requires an audience with Dante Russo, possessing an item of extreme emotional weight. The hostess exhibits defensive posturing, stating the boss accepts no unverified appointments. We now witness a sudden power inversion. Emma opens the velvet box, revealing a heavy platinum ring engraved with the letter R. The gatekeeper immediately experiences cognitive shock. Her constructed facade completely deteriorates under the sudden psychological pressure. Trembling, she signals a massive enforcer named Marco from the shadows. The clinical lesson here is simple. Even the most terrifying giants must stop and listen when their unresolved past finally comes knocking at the door. The subject remains under the chandelier, using rhythmic counting of her own heart rate to manage acute panic. At heartbeat 112, the enforcer returns, granting her 5 minutes. Emma follows him into the internal labyrinth of the syndicate. These corridors are built to disorient targets, stripping away spatial awareness. The auditory thumping of the club dissolves into an oppressive silence. They reach a reinforced oak door, which Marco pushes open. The interior is swallowed by darkness. Save for a window framing the Manhattan skyline, there sits Dante Russo, displaying the chilling immobility of a predatory narcissist. Sometimes, walking straight into our deepest fear is the only real way to discover how truly strong our psychological resilience can be. Observe the subtle physical markers. A faded scar traces the left hemisphere of Dante's skull, indicating severe past trauma. It is a biological record Emma recognizes perfectly. Demonstrating absolute emotional detachment, the syndicate leader pushes the beatbox across the desk, warning her that time is expiring. Emma regulates her breathing, and occupies the leather chair opposite him. Bypassing her ego, she delivers her harsh reality. Her former partner abandoned her for a wealthy heiress, and the wedding occurs in 14 days. She requires Dante to act as her companion. He elevates his gaze, carefully analyzing her behavioral baseline. Never let another individual make you feel inferior just because they lacked the necessary psychological capacity to properly handle your devotion. Emma maintains unblinking eye contact, a direct challenge to his dominance. She informs him they are not unacquainted. The atmospheric pressure shifts instantly. Dante's pupils constrict, his gaze sharpening as he processes that she fully comprehends his psychopathology. Emma offers a tiny nod. She understands his criminal classification and knows whose hand previously wore that band. Dante initiates a physical threat display, rising with the fluid biomechanics of a trained killer. He navigates the room with zero auditory feedback. Emma must suppress her deepest biological imperatives simply to remain seated. It is incredibly difficult for any mind to maintain cognitive control against pure, unfiltered intimidation. Slowly, he extends a hand, isolating the silver ring. The subject fixates on the object, manipulating the metal under the ambient city light. Dropping his vocal frequency, he interrogates her regarding its origin. Emma experiences a sudden breakdown of her fabricated narrative. Deception rapidly disintegrates when exposed to extreme environmental stress. She provides the unfiltered data. He deliberately abandoned it beneath a contaminated hospital pillow in room 412 exactly 24 months prior. The ring ceases movement in his palm. The narcissistic kingpin exhibits a textbook dissociative freeze response. In that oppressive silence, you can almost observe the traumatic flashback consuming his brain, the blinding clinical lights, the frantic, screaming telemetry alarms indicating imminent cardiac failure. His repressed trauma breaches his conscious awareness. He experiences the tactile memory of small hands applying pressure to his thoracic hemorrhages, refusing to accept his clinical termination. The auditory memory of her tone pierces the chaos, demanding he maintain consciousness. Dante forcefully blinks, terminating the flashback, and locks onto Emma. He registers her identity as the physical manifestation of his near-death experience. She reminds him he was medically deceased, but she manually forced his nervous system to reboot. Dante places the artifact down with the meticulous care of a survivor. The most profound debts in human existence are often owed to anonymous figures in our darkest hours. 2 years, he vocalizes, the syllables heavy with lingering ghosts. He notes that his syndicate expended vast resources to locate her, but the medical database showed zero trace of her existence. Emma exhibits a micro-expression of fatigue, confessing to a data wipe out of pure self-preservation. When she exposed his chest cavity, she immediately identified the Russo insignia above his sternum. Dante processes this, realizing she categorized him as a lethal threat, yet chose to intervene. Emma states her clinical mandate is the preservation of biology, regardless of moral deficits. True compassion requires choosing humanity, even when survival instincts demand we flee. Dante physically bridges the spatial gap between them. Lowering his vocal output, he finally admits the platinum band was the sole property of his deceased mother. The artifact served as his primary anchor to maternal attachment. He left it as a binding behavioral contract for reciprocal protection. Emma maintains absolute stoicism. She stares at this apex predator and formally activates the debt. A tremor of disbelief disrupts Dante's facial symmetry. He questions if she is exchanging a priceless relic for a simulated romantic display. She asserts that an object's true value supersedes its financial metric. Dante pauses, recalibrating his strategy. Then, he deploys a highly targeted emotional strike. He asks if she comprehends the exact psychological motive behind her partner's abandonment. Emma's autonomic nervous system plummets. In his ruthless environment, weaponized data is the ultimate currency, and he controls the market. He observes her baseline, calculating the mass of her psychological trauma. He asks if her objective is merely to cast him as a compliant mate. Emma bypasses all defense mechanisms, externalizing her core wound. She requires her betrayer to experience the acute cognitive dissonance of regret. Deep psychological trauma invariably demands a witness, and you and I understand the dark biological urge to inflict reciprocal pain. Dante enters a state of absolute stillness. When he resumes verbalization, the criminal tactician is replaced by a darker psychological architect. He ratifies the agreement. Sliding the box back, he issues a sinister proposition. He intends to instruct her in a methodology far superior to elementary retaliation, forcing her across a dangerous threshold. The subject verbalizes her cognitive confusion. Dante pivots, focusing on the dark river dissecting the urban grid. He initiates a massive paradigm shift. She provided him with biological continuity, and he intends to restructure her entire existence. Using him for a superficial social display is an inadequate exchange for her medical intervention. The vulnerable patient is now fully eclipsed by the megalomaniac. True psychological reconstruction never occurs without dismantling the previous self. Dante outlines his strict parameters. He requires 14 days of total immersion in his secure penthouse. He will not merely train her to project a false narrative of recovery to her betrayer. He plans to condition her psyche to systematically incinerate her former reality. Let us examine the subject, Dante, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist. He retreats into the shadows, promising to reconstruct Miss Sinclair's fractured psyche. The light triggers a flashback to the night his blood pooled on cold tiles, when she alone validated his existence. Here is a clinical truth. Never underestimate the psychological weight of telling a discarded soul they hold value. Nobody ever afforded Dante that human mercy. Her former partner dismantled her self-worth, and Dante intends to obliterate that delusion. Emma stares at the floor, fighting a bitter trauma response. Suddenly, his affect goes completely flat. He delivers a chilling variable. Her ex is a senator's son. Invading a political wedding will ignite a full-scale government war. Dante openly admits that provoking politicians is a boundary he's spent 15 years avoiding. Emma softly whispers that he should just walk away. But Dante is locked in a pathological compulsion. He leans forward, stating he has no choice. To ignore his life debt would violate the only foundational moral framework his mother instilled in him: honor before everything. In this fragile moment, he places his absolute loyalty into her shaking hands. Emma visibly trembles. The sensation creeping down her spine is no longer basic prey-drive fear. It is the crushing weight of holding emotional leverage over a sociopath the city dreads. Her mind regresses to that trauma ward, her hands slick with his blood. The universe truly has a clinical way of flipping the power dynamic. Stick with me. You and I need to analyze this behavioral shift. Focus on Emma, her trembling hands pushing medication into a ruthless kingpin. Dante strictly forbids law enforcement. She surrenders 2 weeks of her autonomy, but fiercely refuses to abandon her patients. Dante gives a slow nod, promising to surround her with his deadliest enforcers. He issues a severe threat assessment. Once the streets know they are linked, she becomes a target for his rival, Salvatore Bianca. His enemies will hunt the innocent simply to observe his psychological deterioration. Emma shakes with pure nervous system overload, yet she still nods. Dante extends his hand to seal their trauma bond. Here is a fundamental truth. Real courage is being terrified, yet reaching out to shake the hand of the devil. Observe Dante as he asks if they have an agreement. Emma lowers her gaze to his scarred hand. It is the exact hand she stabilized 2 years ago when his pulse was fading beneath her fingertips. She reaches out and grips it. Dante does not release her. He maintains physical contact, his thumb slowly tracing the fragile ridge of her knuckles. This is classic proprietary behavior. He tells her he is not just repaying a debt, he is claiming total ownership of her for the next 14 days. He swears no one will inflict trauma, induce fear, or diminish her psychological state again. The violent palpitations of Emma's heart practically deafen her. She barely manages a micro-expression of a nod. Dante states that transport will arrive at 6 in the morning, then pivots away. Emma stands up, her gross motor skills failing so violently. Her knees threaten to buckle. She clutches a velvet box, processing the realization that her previous baseline of reality is terminated. Cut to 5:45 the morning after. A sleek black Mercedes idles outside her apartment in Queens. The visual contrast is absurd, a flawless diamond discarded on a filthy sidewalk. Exhausted from sleep deprivation, Emma secures her door. Before she hits the pavement, the driver steps out. He is a massive subject, built like a concrete wall, yet he projects a highly conditioned politeness. He introduces himself as Luca. Pay close attention to these quiet enforcers. The subjects who regulate their vocal tone the most are typically the ones suppressing the darkest homicidal impulses. You analyze an enforcer like Luca, and you would never diagnose the cognitive dissonance tearing his psyche apart. There will come a brutal day when Luca stands in the dark, his firearm trembling violently. The authority figure who ordered the slaughter of his biological family will turn out to be the exact same paternal surrogate who sheltered him. This is a severe, weaponized form of Stockholm Syndrome. That magnitude of betrayal fractures a mind beyond repair. Today, however, Luca simply states he will guard her, opening the door in clinical silence. They glide over the bridge as the sun hits the river. Emma sits in the back, inhaling the atmosphere of undeniable dominance. For the first time, her depressive isolation lifts. Stepping out, she enters a monument to absolute control. We pan across a penthouse that is aesthetically flawless, yet psychologically barren. 3 floors constructed out of glass, steel, and endless black marble. It is so brutally devoid of personal artifacts that the ambient temperature feels freezing, designed entirely to suppress human emotion. Out of the shadows steps a silver-haired subject at the base of a floating staircase. Her rigid biomechanics mirror a military commander. She introduces herself as Giovanna, the primary administrator of this fortress. Emma follows her up the cold steps, passing a sector where a single priceless painting exists in sensory deprivation. Giovanna opens the doors to a guest suite that dwarfs Emma's previous socioeconomic status. When you bleed to save a sociopath, the behavioral reinforcement is extravagant. The adjoining bathroom is sculpted from pale stone, functioning as a silent temple of sensory indulgence. Beyond it, a wardrobe overflows with delicate silk textiles. Giovanna casually mentions the garments will fit perfectly, noting Mr. Russo covertly acquired her precise biometric measurements while she slept in the vehicle. Emma freezes, a spike of cognitive dissonance hitting her chest as she questions this intrusion. Giovanna flashes a thin, sociopathic smile, dryly claiming Dante is merely highly observant. A startled laugh escapes Emma's throat. It is the first authentic dopamine release she has experienced since Harrison shattered her ego. Dante stands in the doorway, draped in black. He exudes the controlling energy of a man who dictates environmental variables before dawn. Emma asks if he perpetually avoids the deep sleep cycle. Dante's gaze remains flat, devoid of standard social cues. He admits he functions on 4 hours of sleep, a grim physiological adaptation to his lifestyle. Now, you and I need to observe this next interaction under a microscope. At 7 on the dot, Emma enters the kitchen, centered around a cold slab of white marble. Dante lowers his reading material. His eyes lock onto hers, demanding every agonizing data point regarding Harrison Whitmore. Emma's fine motor skills degrade as she lifts her espresso. She softly deconstructs the fragile illusion of their attachment. 2 years together, engaged to a man she perceived as flawless. When interrogated, Emma confesses the truth. Harrison traded her loyalty for an heiress to secure political power. Dante's hypervigilance sees right through that defense mechanism. He leans forward, demanding the unfiltered trauma. Emma breaks eye contact, old psychological wounds hemorrhaging open. She details that at a crowded charity function, Harrison's inhibitions were compromised by alcohol. Standing before hundreds of socialites, he began to display overt sadistic behaviors. Her voice fractures. Harrison publicly degraded her, loudly projecting he was dodging a bullet by refusing to marry a nurse beneath his narcissistic status. The entire ballroom exhibited herd mentality and laughed. Even her mother chuckled to mask her own social anxiety. Across the counter, Dante's calm pupils suddenly dilate, swallowing the light. Never systematically humiliate the quiet individuals who stabilized your reality. The behavioral profile degrades further. Harrison mailed her a wedding invitation, designating her as a guest, a calculated tactic to inflict emotional distress. At that data point, Dante slams his hands onto the marble surface. You can observe the violent physiological restraint vibrating in his musculature, fighting the urge to dismantle the room. He issues a soft directive to finish her meal, stating they have operational protocols to initiate. When Emma asks what they are starting, Dante locks onto her consciousness, revealing the cold-blooded, antisocial promise in his stare. He informs her, completely devoid of empathy, that he will reprogram her into Harrison's ultimate psychological trigger. We are documenting the genesis of a severe trauma bond here. Dante escorts her to a subterranean sector, a blank, clinical testing arena waiting for a meticulously orchestrated tragedy. Tonight, you and I are opening a classic psychiatric case file on survival behavior. We observe the subject, Emma, frozen in a cavernous studio smelling of cold chalk and hardwood. Dante stands in the shadows, issuing a clinical directive. Walk across the floor. Emma drags her feet, her shoulders exhibiting the defensive folding of a battered psyche. Her gaze is fixed to the floorboards, a subconscious plea to remain unseen. Dante halts her immediately. He analyzes her physical submission, stating she moves like a phantom apologizing for consuming oxygen. She attempts a verbal defense, but the psychological block silences her. He clinically corrects her tucked chin, the universal stance of a subject conditioned for erasure. Less is profound. Never diminish your presence to keep others comfortable in the dark. Claiming the space beneath your feet is the first breath of survival. A cognitive realization crashes over Emma. She has worn this defensive armor her entire existence, carrying it into spaces dominated by a megalomaniac narcissist of an ex-partner. Dante steps behind her with a controlled silence. She detects his proximity, but He maintains a strict clinical boundary, swearing never to initiate contact without explicit consent. "Can I adjust your stance?" he asks. She issues a trembling nod. His palms settle onto her frail shoulders, retracting them to expand her chest cavity. A single finger elevates her chin just a fraction. The physiological shift is immediate, flooding her lungs with oxygen and shattering deep neural pathways of subjugation. True psychological recovery requires a very simple courage, the absolute bravery to stand erect and face a hostile world without blinking. The silence stretches to a psychological breaking point. Dense, with unvocalized trauma, Dante decreases the physical distance, his breath interacting with the sensory receptors on her neck. His vocal register drops, cutting cleanly through her rising panic. He instructs her that this biological vessel belongs exclusively to her, invalidating the men who systematically dismantled her self-worth. Her pulse accelerates, an autonomic response blending historical terror with emerging ego strength. For the first time, the deep neurological chains of her conditioning begin to fail. She closes her eyes, utilizing his dangerous certainty to stabilize her fractured psyche. Regardless of the scarring inflicted by abusers, your mind remains a private sanctuary. It will always wait patiently for you to forcefully seize the keys of control. 3 exhaustive hours elapse, leaving the subject neurologically depleted. Her musculature tremors, yet Dante enforces the behavioral protocol. He paces the perimeter, deconstructing the dark psychology of social dominance. He commands her to decelerate her motor patterns. A dominant figure forces the environment to wait. He instructs. If an antagonist initiates eye contact, she must sustain the visual lock until their confidence collapses. Later, Emma drops to the floorboards, consuming fluids to recover. Her internal cognitive dissonance then vocalizes. She questions why a criminal operative would dedicate personal resources to a traumatized nurse instead of liquidating the debt with cash. Dante remains clinically unfazed. The most profound emotional debts humans accumulate are precisely the ones that superficial currency can never resolve. The sociopathic facade of the syndicate leader fractures, exposing the traumatized individual beneath. Dante verbalizes a chilling truth. Upon waking to find her near him, his survival instinct was to terminate her life. Her clinical knowledge rendered her a severe liability. A physiological tremor ripples through Emma at this blunt assessment, yet his vocal cadence softens into unexpected vulnerability. He analyzes the medical directive she had left. That final handwritten sentence bypassed his psychological defenses. "Please live. Somebody is waiting for you to come home." Emma attempts a defensive deflection, stating it is a standardized phrase used for all subjects. Dante decreases the gap, projecting immense grief. "I am not every patient," he corrects. Pure empathy functions as a psychological disruptor, successfully neutralizing the most lethal predators in the dark. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? This is the exact clinical juncture where grief catalyzes into psychological empowerment. Emma operates as a complete isolate, her biological support system entirely deceased. Bypassing standard boundaries, Dante places his hand over her digits. He reveals a calculated attachment, admitting he left his signet ring with her as a direct distress signal, so she could summon him when her safety was compromised. Soon, his penthouse evolves into a behavioral conditioning laboratory. Dante constructs a high-stress simulation at the dining table, utilizing complex cutlery as an intimidation tactic. An authoritative older woman sits opposite her, functioning as the primary stressor. The clinical takeaway is striking. Surrogate support structures, constructed from trauma are frequently far more resilient than the biological bloodlines you lost, observes Sonora Castellano. Presenting with rigid composure, she exhibits the ingrained authority of a matriarchal sociopath. Dante labels her a family consultant, a clinical euphemism for a psychological enforcer. For this exposure therapy, she assumes the persona of the toxic mother of Emma's abuser. She initiates a calculated verbal assault, utilizing a deceptively warm vocal register to dissect Emma's insecurities. An acute autonomic fear response restricts Emma's airway. Her ingrained trauma conditioning demands she submit and apologize for her existence. We witness an involuntary flashback to the megalomaniac narcissist Harrison, his cruel laughter echoing in her cortex. The emotional distress is severe, yet psychological capitulation is no longer an option. You cannot permit intrusive memories of trauma to dictate your neurological baseline. To survive the exposure, you must cognitively reclaim your own narrative. In a striking display of neuroplasticity, the submissive behavioral loops finally extinguish. Emma executes a regulated breath, elevating her chin to establish sustained eye contact with the primary stressor. Accessing a new ego defense, she verbally retaliates with clinical precision, exhibiting a controlled smile. She deflects the hostility and firmly asserts her own self-preservation. It is a textbook manifestation of functional psychological armor. Peripherally, she registers Dante delivering almost on a positive reinforcement script. During her victimization phase, this subtle unprocessed, but today it stabilizes her amygdala. The Sonora prepares a secondary escalation, but a mobile device vibrates against the marble. Dante processes the data, and his microexpressions shift to pure hostility. True cognitive confidence operates as an internalized weapon. Once properly forged, external actors can never disarm you. Dante does not exhibit a standard startle response. He drops into the autonomic stillness of a high-functioning sociopath preparing for conflict. Relocating to the terrace, he paces like a cornered predator while vocalizing aggressive Italian directives. Emma's auditory processing catches 3 distinct markers: Bianchi, murder. When he re-enters the environment, his facial affect flattened into a dissociative state. When she probes for threat analysis, he employs a paternalistic deception, instructing her to suppress her anxiety. But the fearful subject has been permanently rewritten. She stands erect, enforcing a strict psychological boundary. She cites her previous life-saving intervention as a mandate for absolute operational transparency. Healthy boundaries require extreme courage to enforce. If you are subjected to the trauma of the conflict, you deserve full cognitive awareness of the threat. Let us unpack this fascinating pathology together. Dante dissects the operational reality for Emma with chilling precision. Salvatore Bianca, his apex rival, is orchestrating a summit with Senator Whitmore, the patriarch of the man who shattered Emma's psyche. The physiological response is instant blood drains from her face. Dante explains the lethal calculus. If Bianca secures the senator, he weaponizes the federal government to erase Dante's syndicate. A suffocating panic constricts Emma. This is not coincidence. It is a calculated nightmare orchestrated by a megalomaniac. The clinical lesson is undeniable. Trauma inevitably resurfaces from the subconscious, not to destroy the vulnerable host, but to force the victim to finally forge their psychological defenses and fight back. The cognitive realization crushes Emma's fragile equilibrium. If she infiltrates the wedding as the syndicate leader's companion, her former abusers will weaponize her unresolved trauma. She exhibits a classic flight response, trembling and begging Dante to abort the operation to avoid a gang war. Dante, operating with unyielding control, utterly rejects her surrender. He closes the distance, his massive hands acting as a physical restraint on her fingers. His ocular focus is absolute. He clinically reminds her of her psychological evolution from a traumatized victim into a formidable survivor, strictly forbidding her cognitive regression. Never allow the paralyzing anticipation of an unseen threat to strip away the autonomy and psychological closure you have bled to rebuild. We observe a shift here the moment the prey adopts the pathology of the predator. Survivor guilt consumes Emma, but Dante neutralizes her limbic panic with absolute calm. He clinically states the war is an active threat. The ruthless architect reveals a rare crack in his armor. Protecting an asset does not induce anxiety. It merely sharpens his violent utility. Emma analyzes his micro-expressions, finding only an obsessive, trauma-bonded devotion. He guarantees her abuser will suffer psychological devastation at the wedding. What unfolds is a magnificent cognitive restructuring. True resilience is never just about bandaging a bleeding wound. It requires finding a righteous purpose that renders your mind entirely bulletproof against manipulation. Day 4 initiates a radical behavioral modification. Dante introduces Celine, an aesthetic specialist who assesses Emma's physical metrics with predatory calculation. She notes that beneath the severe exhaustion lies the biological foundation of dominance. The room floods with luxury textiles, triggering cognitive dissonance in Emma as she processes garments far exceeding her socioeconomic reality. Celine acts as the ruthless filter, isolating a magnificent gown, the exact shade of arterial blood. Analyze this psychological intervention carefully. Reconstructing external presentation is never mere vanity. When a subject's ego is completely fractured, selecting the precise physical armor is the critical first step in reclaiming absolute dominance over your former abusers. The arterial red garment functions as a psychological weapon. As Emma analyzes her reflection, she experiences beneficial dissociation, unable to recognize the predator staring back. Dante observes from the periphery, his narcissistic validation evident in his silence. He clinically guarantees her abuser will experience respiratory distress upon seeing her. By the 5th day, conditioning shifts to kinesthetic dominance. Dante programs the precise motor patterns of a waltz into her muscle memory under low stimulus lighting. The psychological lesson is foundational. Authentic cognitive transformation is a brutal, exhausting ritual. One must complete severe neurological conditioning in total isolation before executing absolute dominance in the public arena. Dante anchors his hand against her spine, asserting the physical ownership typical of a narcissist shielding an asset. He initiates a predictive behavioral analysis, warning Harrison will attempt an interception, and instructs her to deploy an emotional freeze response. Emma is confused, unable to process why her discarder would reinitiate contact. Dante expertly deconstructs the fragile male ego. Abusers suffer severe psychological injury when a superior rival elevates the victim they previously devalued. Later, Emma resumes clinical duties with Luca positioned as a visual deterrent. Never permit a pathological abuser to re-enter your proximity merely because you successfully engineered your own psychological elevation. Under the severe fluorescent stimuli of the ward, a colleague notices the bodyguard. Emma deploys a calculated smirk, masking her trauma bond by categorizing Luke as an associate. Dante soon escalates her exposure therapy in a high-status environment where she navigates the social matrix flawlessly. Yet, the baseline resets within the armored vehicle's perimeter. Dante disrupts her progress with a clinical evaluation. She operates at 60% efficiency due to acute imposter syndrome. From the darkness, he probes her familial origin trauma. The cognitive lesson is absolute. Fabricating an external persona only grants initial access. Lasting dominance requires a neurological rewiring to accept that you inherently belong at the apex. The behavioral armor fractures. Inside the vehicle, Emma processes her core developmental traumas, maternal loss, paternal grief, and the systemic exhaustion of funding her siblings' education. Dante clinically inquires if her brother knows about the narcissist who fractured her psyche. Emma admits her brother exhibited a protective aggression response, desiring to assault Harrison. Dante reinforces this as appropriate masculine pathology. Suddenly, he initiates a psychological interrogation. He references their initial contact during his critical surgery, demanding to know the exact words she whispered to his unconscious form. The clinical takeaway is profound. Micro-expressions of authentic empathy can subconsciously and permanently rewrite your entire trajectory. A flush betrays Emma as she confesses her whispered words. She pleaded with his failing biological system to persist, claiming the world required his aesthetic genetics. She assumed he was comatose. Instead, Dante confirms sensory retention of every syllable. He used her vocal stimulus as the cognitive anchor to survive his injuries, specifically to hunt her down. By day 8, she endures another grueling medical cycle, combating mortality while anticipating a violent syndicate collision. She exits at dawn, saturated in the olfactory triggers of antiseptic and adrenal depletion. The pathology of resilience dictates this truth. Superior survivors never passively await rescue. They actively engage the hostile environment and execute the recovery independently. Stick with me, the behavioral sequencing becomes unstable here. Claustrophobia triggers an acute panic response. Luca maintains a perimeter, but the confined vehicle induces respiratory distress in Emma. She demands pedestrian exposure. The dense fog acts as a sensory deprivation chamber, isolating her in an illusion of civilian normalcy. For 1 minute, her hypervigilance deactivates. This cognitive relaxation is a severe vulnerability. Without warning, a silhouette materializes from the low visibility, entirely obstructing her trajectory. The clinical reality of trauma recovery is absolute. The precise microsecond a subject voluntarily deactivates their psychological armor is exactly when the pathological abuser emerges to reinitiate the toxic cycle. The fog dissipates, revealing Harrison exhibiting the posture of a grandiose narcissist. He falsely categorizes his predatory tracking as a coincidence. Emma refuses the trauma bond, clinically identifying his stalking behavior. Harrison pivots to the covert savior dynamic, framing Dante as the primary threat. He aggressively breaches her proxemic barrier, attempting physical intimidation to trigger her conditioned submission. Emma maintains absolute autonomic stability. She holds eye contact, asserting the syndicate predator has demonstrated higher empathy than Harrison ever possessed. He emits a psychopathic laugh. Retain this clinical data. The most lethal neurological toxin we ever ingest is the manipulative voice we once misidentified as authentic affection. Analyze the narcissistic audacity here. Harrison uses linguistic devaluation, mocking the idea that an apex entity like Dante could attach to a clinical subordinate. He weaponizes her occupational title to regress her into a subordinate state. The previous Emma would have suffered an ego collapse. Not under this conditioning. She aligns her spine, adopting the psychopathic baseline Dante programmed. The dominance matrix violently inverts. Lowering her vocal amplitude, she states she can chemically detect the fear radiating from his biology. Why engage in covert stalking when he already secured his wealthy bride? The clinical diagnosis is final. The exact millisecond you internalize your intrinsic value, pathological abusers entirely lose all psychological leverage to fracture your mind. Let us open this case file together, you and I, and observe the total collapse of a fragile ego. Notice how Emma dismantles Harrison in the morning mist. When she questions his stalking, his psychological armor shatters. He realizes the woman he discarded is now shielded by an apex predator he fears. Emma delivers the fatal blow, declaring a true man's respect outweighs a boy's hollow affection. Harrison snaps, resorting to physical violence as he grabs her arm. Instantly, Luca materializes from the fog, his fingers wrapping around cold steel inside his coat. He softly commands Harrison to retreat. The coward shrinks, screaming about his senator father to protect himself. The clinical lesson here is undeniable. Inherited wealth and loud titles mean absolutely nothing when standing face to face with violent consequence. Luca displays classic apathy, his flat voice stating that a senator father means zero. Harrison shoots Emma a venomous glare, warning her away from his wedding before vanishing into the fog. During the silent ride to the penthouse, Emma exhibits acute stress tremors. When the doors part, Dante waits in the dark foyer, projecting the lethal stillness of a territorial predator. He watched the surveillance, and his rage over another male physically threatening his partner is absolute. Emma attempts a defense mechanism, acting tough, but Dante coldly states Harrison just triggered his own destruction. Barking into his phone, he orders the excavation of every buried Whitmore and Chica secret. A vital life lesson emerges here. True protection never relies on empty words, but demands swift, absolute action. The psychological puzzle pieces finally connect. Dante, recognizing the behavioral limits of a coward, knows Harrison lacks the internal drive for this audacity unless the Bianchi syndicate is pulling his strings. He clinically warns Emma that the glittering wedding is merely a predator's trap. Hours later, the club shuts down, moving the inner circle into a secure room. Marco and Luca wait, but the true anomaly sits quietly in the corner. Sonora Castellano. Emma experiences a severe cognitive shift, realizing her mild etiquette teacher is actually the ruthless architect behind 4 decades of organized crime. She perfectly masked her absolute lethality. The lesson we can draw is undeniable. Never ignore the quiet, unassuming souls in the corner of the room, for they usually hold the real power. The atmospheric pressure in the boardroom mirrors the tension of a locked psychiatric ward. We observe Enzo, an analytical mind whose glasses catch the harsh light. He displays a textbook flat affect, radiating a chilling, calculated stillness. Without making eye contact with Emma, he drops surveillance photographs onto the oak table. These images document a clandestine nightmare of human greed. Bianchi, a rival megalomaniac, sits alongside a corrupt senator and Harrison. They drink scotch, while Bianchi offers $20 million in blood money to fund Harrison's political aspirations. The psychological profile of a traitor is now complete. A clear life lesson is written in this transaction. Unchecked ambition will always compel a fundamentally weak man to willingly sell his soul to the highest bidder. You and I know from studying these criminal pathologies that dirty money always demands a violent return. The tension spikes as Dante senses the psychological cage closing, ordering Enzo to disclose the rest. Enzo delivers the fatal reality without a trace of human empathy. Bianchi intends to erase Dante from existence, expecting Harrison to weaponize government resources or pull the trigger himself. Emma experiences acute sympathetic nervous system shock as the assassination plot is laid bare. Then, Sonora Castellano pierces the silence. She notes this high society wedding is a textbook manipulation, a meticulously crafted snare meant to isolate the target. The lesson we take away from this is brutal. When you wander into a predator's territory, they will weaponize your innocence without a single second of hesitation. The syndicate plans to manufacture a false narrative for the public, projecting a fatal robbery to mask their violence. Dante locks onto Emma, his gaze heavy with the reality of terminal consequence. If they enter that building, he warns, the rival faction will slaughter him and bury her as collateral damage. A typical civilian would experience a complete mental fracture here, but Dante operates on the extreme end of the survival spectrum. A terrifying smile curves his lips, signaling the shift from prey back to apex predator. They will attend, he whispers, but they will hijack the snare entirely. He outlines a counter-offensive with chilling cognitive precision. We find a profound life lesson in his strategy. Never run blindly from a trap when you possess the intellect to turn it into your own lethal weapon. Emma exhibits stress paralysis, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of a megalomaniac's ambition. With deadpan calm, Dante states he will eliminate a corrupt senator and a rival boss simultaneously. He intends to transform an elegant wedding into a political funeral, erasing the Bianchi bloodline forever. Enzo warns this triggers total war, begging for federal intervention and mass casualties. Dante simply nods. His psychological fixation is entirely centered on Emma, driving him to accept fatal risks. Yet she refuses to let him immolate his own empire to satisfy a protective urge. This dynamic teaches us a profound truth about human attachment. Genuine connection means actively shielding a person from their own destructive sacrifices. Dante slowly rises, closing the distance until he stands mere inches from her. Dante lowers his voice, cutting through the thick, clinical tension. He insists his motive lacks noble sacrifice. He has obsessed over this violent catalyst for 2 years. Ever since her trembling hands treated his wounds, his internal identity fractured. He could no longer operate strictly as a sociopathic enforcer because she provided a behavioral anchor for his redemption. The hardened boss mask quickly returns. They have 6 days. He vows Emma will not enter that church as a traumatized victim, but as an apex figure ready to restructure their reality. The psychological lesson here is striking. The right external influence can completely rewire a damaged mind's dark destiny. Later at 1 a.m, Emma suffers from acute insomnia, wandering the dark penthouse halls to escape her racing, anxious thoughts. The penthouse living room is swallowed by the ambient glow of the skyline. Out on the freezing terrace, we observe Dante leaning against the iron rail. He smokes a cigar, an oral fixation that betrays the crushing stress load resting on his shoulders. Emma steps out into the biting temperature drop. She asks if his hypervigilance is keeping him awake, and he clinically admits his sleep patterns are shattered. The wind catches her hair as she presents the ultimate psychological probe. She asks if he is genuinely terrified of the impending violence. Dante breaks his stoic facade, looks directly at her, and simply admits yes. We must recognize a vital life lesson here. True mental fortitude is not the blind absence of fear, but the quiet willingness to verbally admit when you are absolutely terrified. Emma anticipates Dante will re-establish his impenetrable defensive armor. Instead, he dismantles his psychological walls entirely. He is not afraid of federal prison or rival violence. He is experiencing the paralyzing phobia of failing his primary emotional anchor. He dreads that, when the blood spills, she will finally perceive him as the monster society labels him. Emma closes the physical distance, asking how he assumes she views him now. Dante breaks eye contact, his voice fracturing with uncharacteristic vulnerability. She looks at him like he is actually capable of rehabilitation, he whispers. The life lesson here is profound. Sometimes, it takes one external soul validating your humanity before you can abandon the dark. Instantly, the ruthless enforcer wraps his coat around her, blocking the bitter cold. The transferred heat of his coat acts as a physiological barrier against the trauma of the cold. Then, Dante shatters the silence with a jarring confession. You and I must look closely at the clinical weight of this moment. 2 years prior, waking from a coma as a broken shell, he registered Emma's presence before anyone else. She was providing physical grounding, holding his hand, projecting her own grief by begging him not to die. Emma tries to repress the memory, but Dante recorded every syllable. When she exited, he hid his mother's ring beneath her cushion. It was a textbook transference of an emotional artifact to his caretaker. The lesson here is profound. The quiet sacrifices we leave behind for others are often the exact behavioral mechanisms that end up saving our own lives. Analyze the intense emotional reality of this midnight interaction. Emma locks onto his exhausted pupils, her vocal cords trembling but resolute, verbalizing a promise that her flight response is permanently disabled. She will not run. Dante endured 2 isolated years, yet he confesses a relentless fixation on the medical worker who humanized him while he bled on a gurney. A stress-relieving laugh escapes Emma's lips as tears break her composure. She elevates a shaking hand to make physical contact with his scarred jaw. The apex predator leans his weight into her fragile palm, establishing a permanent attachment bond. He promises to never detach from her again. The life lesson here is absolute. True human loyalty remains anchored, even as the countdown to violent war begins. We do not abandon bonds forged in pure fire. You and I have seen this pathology before. Dante closes his eyes, dropping his hypervigilant defenses under her touch. Yet, his ingrained guilt compels one final warning. He is an apex predator with absolute blood on his hands. Emma remains clinically detached, revealing she studied his medical file 2 years ago. She knows this enforcer willingly took 3 bullets to the chest to shield an innocent child. Dante freezes, his cognitive dissonance shattering. Overcome by her unconditional acceptance, he pulls her in for a desperate, anchoring kiss, a cure for a psychological starvation brewing for 2 long years. He is finally regulating his breath. The clinical lesson here: never diagnose a soul purely by the shadows they cast. The most terrifying reputations often conceal fiercely protective hearts. When the subjects break apart, Dante rests his heavy forehead against hers. His voice, reduced to a fractured whisper, demonstrates the ultimate psychological surrender of a highly dangerous man. He confesses his autonomy is gone, his life now tethered entirely to her. Emma nods through her tears, willingly stepping into his violent shadow. Fast forward to day 14, the final phase. Emma wakes to the steady drum of his heartbeat. Though they share this bed, Dante operates as a clinical protector. He never breaches her physical boundaries, bound by an obsessive reverence for his anchor. He gently traces her hair, murmuring that today the paradigm shifts entirely. There is a profound clinical observation here. True power is never found in brute force, but in possessing the absolute restraint to honor the person you love. Emma confesses that the impending confrontation triggers acute psychological terror. Dante seamlessly adopts the role of her grounding mechanism, promising to be her physical shield when those cathedral doors open. At 9, the styling team initiates a blur of intense aesthetic modification. 3 hours later, Emma stares into the mirror to dissociate. The quiet nurse from 3 weeks prior has been eradicated. In her place stands the queen of a criminal empire. Her gaze is flattened into a predatory stare, and her lips painted a dangerous wine red to match her gown. The behavioral lesson here is critical. When you prepare to walk into a den of apex predators, you must construct a flawless exterior shell. Deeply rooted confidence is always the sharpest weapon you can carry into the hardest battles. The camera pans down the sweeping marble stairs. Emma's dark gown projects a cold, untouchable behavioral authority. Dante waits below in a sharp black tuxedo. For a subject who routinely dictates absolute terror, he stands completely paralyzed by a surge of dopamine. He watches her descend, mesmerized by her psychological rebirth into underworld royalty. The silence breaks when he reveals a weathered leather box. Inside sits a heavy diamond necklace, a relic belonging to his late mother. His voice a low rumble, instructing that she must wear it to mentally mark her assimilation into his blood-stained life. When you finally step out to face the sociopaths of your past, always carry the legacy of those who genuinely loved you. Let their memory function as your unbreakable psychological shield. Let us look at this moment closely, you and I. Dante fastens the cold diamonds around her neck, his fingers tracing her spine to stimulate a calming response before pulling her back. The house manager watches, offering a slow nod of absolute compliance. A psychological warning echoes through the dim foyer. They are not attending a social ritual today. They are initiating a calculated war. That heavy truth hangs in the air as they sink into a black sedan. Dante stares out the tinted glass, mentally reviewing the final parameters of his trap. His operatives hold an explosive dossier, ready to trigger a mass media frenzy at exactly 3 o'clock. If you must wage psychological warfare against the demons of your past, never strike until your strategy is flawless and entirely devoid of human mercy. The steel trap is finally pulled tight. Federal agents wait in unmarked cars 2 blocks from the target zone. Highly reactive reporters pace the sidewalks, eager to trigger a narcissistic injury on a corrupt senator. Even the cowardly fixer attempting a flight response will find Dante's enforcers blocking the tarmac. Nobody breathes in this grid without Dante's authorization. He analyzes the gray streets that once subjected Emma to severe trauma. He assures her the narcissist who shattered her psyche is finally hers to dismantle. She merely squeezes his hand, stating she only wants her abuser to face the resurrected ghost of the victim he discarded. The sharpest behavioral revenge you can ever execute is outgrowing the subjects who were pathologically blind to your true value. Dante traces the back of her hand, a physical anchor signaling that the psychological warfare is already won. The sedan halts at the foot of the cathedral. Outside the glass, the herd mentality of the press is totally unhinged. These behavioral scavengers can smell fresh trauma. The door opens, and Dante steps into the biting cold. He projects the aura of an apex predator, leading Emma straight into an aggressive storm of camera flashes. Reporters scream his name, desperate to understand why the city's darkest phantom is attending this social ritual. He starves them of data, offering nothing but a chilling, empty sociopathic smile as he extends his arm. Remember this when building your own psychological framework. In a society desperate for validation, the absolute silence is the most devastating weapon you can wield. They initiate their march up the stone stairs. Emma projects a stunning manifestation of cold, trauma-forged confidence. She modulates her movements exactly the way Dante conditioned her. Chin tilted high, shoulders retracted. Her dark eyes lock onto the massive doors, clinically blind to the frantic explosion of camera bulbs. She glides with the entitlement of an apex predator. Suddenly, a breathless shout breaks the herd's white noise. The press finally identifies her. The shattered victim is walking arm in arm with the untouchable Dante. Emma hardly breaks her baseline rhythm, offering only the faintest, cruelest micro-expression of a smile. The clinical lesson: keep your chin raised, your chin phrased through the worst emotional fires. The second you fully integrate your own power, the world has no choice but to step out of your way. Let us observe this systemic collapse together. The heavy doors thud shut, sealing the environment. The air is thick with sensory triggers melting wax and the bitter pheromones of old money. Within a fractional second, the warm, narcissistic chatter of 200 guests crashes into a suffocating, hyper-vigilant silence. Every neck snaps toward the stimulus. This is the exact clinical second the grand illusion dies. Near the altar, the corrupt senator freezes, his fight-or-flight response failing entirely as his dilated eyes find Dante. His wife's motor controls glitch, dumping champagne down her pearls. Up front, the foolish boy who fractured Emma's psyche remains blind to the impending slaughter. Behavioral karma is never polite. When the bill for your pathology finally comes due, it just kicks the wood right off its hinges. Harrison shifts his gaze to the back of the room. The millisecond his visual cortex processes Emma, his autonomic nervous system crashes. His respiratory drive stalls, and his extremities go limp. The bride has not even appeared, yet cold, stress-induced sweat is already soaking his collar. With terrifying behavioral authority, Dante guides Emma down the velvet runner. Every step is a calculated psychological strike, anchoring them exactly in the fifth row. It is close enough to deliberately torture Harrison's spatial awareness, but distant enough to demonstrate complete untouchability. They sit down like an apex pair usurping a stolen hierarchy. The wealthy woman beside them is trembling in shock. Never forget this hard truth. Simply walking into a room neurologically whole and healed is enough to completely shatter the narcissist who tried to destroy you. Emma turns to the trembling woman, displaying a mastery of cognitive dissonance. She offers a saccharine smile, whispering that the known sociopath beside her is merely her date. The poor woman chokes on her own oxygen, totally paralyzed. The mournful organ sounds as the bride materializes. Victoria presents a flawless physical aesthetic, but her eyes are completely dead. She drags her feet like a depersonalized ghost. Halfway down the aisle, she spots Emma sitting in total peace beside the city's apex predator. Victoria's motor coordination fails. Her expensive heel catches on the velvet runner. Dante tilts his head, offering one chilling, micro-aggressive nod. The bride's complexion turns to ash. Consider the tragedy of this psychological frame. You can never build a stable future when the repressed sins of your past are staring you down from the fifth row. Emma registers Harrison's desperate gaze from the altar. Employing classic behavioral conditioning, she starves him of the narcissistic supply he craves, refusing any eye contact. Instead, she pivots to Dante, deliberately sliding her hand onto his thigh. It is a devastating demonstration of Stockholm-esque ownership. Dante leans close, his voice grazing her ear to clinically note that she makes every subject in this room look pathetic. The social ritual degrades into a psychological car crash. Harrison's vocal cords seize. He chokes on his vows, his voice cracking as his fragile ego publicly shatters. In the front row, The corrupt senator exhibits severe physiological panic, frantically typing for an extraction that will never arrive. This is the ultimate cognitive unraveling. Panic is simply the biological manifestation of a guilty pathology, and the apex predator always collects his due. Let us pause right here, you and I, to examine this behavioral display. Dante murmurs his dark reassurance. The senator can type until his thumbs bleed, but Dante has chained every exit. A classic display of a megalomaniacal narcissist controlling his environment. The priest declares the pair married, their kiss, a stiff, hollow performance. Marching down the aisle, Harrison stops dead. He abandons his bride, staring at Emma, his voice trembling, as he whispers he never believed she would come. Watch her micro-expressions closely. Emma looks into his shattered eyes with pure frost. No anger remains, only a polite, gutting congratulations on his empty union. The deepest psychological peace a person can find is looking the ghost of their trauma right in the eye and feeling absolutely nothing. Observe the suffocating tension saturating that room. The foolish man bleeds over the prize he tossed aside, suffering a complete ego collapse. Victoria hisses, pulling at Harrison's arm, but he stays planted, begging for one final word with Emma. It is a fatal miscalculation. Dante stands up. His rise from the pew is so dangerously controlled that the cathedral stops breathing. He towers over the crumbling room, his voice like cold steel, informing Harrison he no longer holds the right to speak her name. A gasp from the elite echoes off the stone. As the humiliated bride hauls her hollow husband away, the clinical lesson writes itself. If you leave a delicate thing out in the cold, never complain when a darker force claims it. Emma sits motionless, absorbing his terrifying protection. The focus shifts to a ballroom bleeding with obscene wealth. Crystal chandeliers hang like glittering cages above white roses, spelling out the names of a doomed couple. When the brass doors swing open, Emma and Dante do not walk in like guests. They stride across the marble like conquerors surveying a fresh slaughter. The polite jazz instantly dies. Every diamond-draped neck snaps toward the doorway. Some stare in pure terror, while others lean in, thirsty for the psychological spectacle. The gold clock ticks heavily toward 2:45. The air feels like wet cement. Keep this bitter reality in mind as we proceed. You can throw millions at a rotting romance, but cash cannot buy you cognitive peace when the devil is on your guest list. The countdown to their ruin is underway. The lens lingers on the heavy shadows of the ballroom, 15 minutes before the great societal illusion shatters. Dante's hand moves with terrifying stillness, slipping the phone from his pocket to send a single command. On cue, Senator Whitmore approaches. His smile is painted on, but the glaring chandelier catches the terrified gleam of cold sweat on his temple. He feigns surprise at the sight of a crime lord. Dante tilts his head, a dead, freezing smile on his lips, murmuring he only came for Emma, the priceless object the senator's boy discarded. The older man's cheeks burn red with shame. Look closely at this interaction, you and I. Societal power is nothing but a paper mask, and the behavioral skeletons you bury in the dark will always claw their way out to collect their toll. The senator stammers, forcing a dry, defensive laugh to mask his rising panic. Dante silences him with a gaze of quiet violence, then strikes the match. He whispers of Whitmore's hidden meetings with Salvatore Bianchi, the phantom rival of the underworld. All color washes from the politician's sagging face as his cognitive dissonance fractures. He tries to deny it, hands shaking, but Dante just asks softly why clean men tremble. The psychological destruction is absolute. As the clock chimes 3, hundreds of phones erupt. A mechanical chorus drowns the weeping string quartet. A woman's sharp shriek pierces the room, begging for the screens to be turned on. Remember this clinical tragedy well. Every dirty secret has a ticking clock, and the deepest lies will always burn when exposed to the light. Analyze the agonizing mechanics of this public execution. Over the marble bar, a monitor loops elegant guest arrivals. Without warning, a blood-red banner violently slashes across the glass. The anchor's flat voice rings out, stripping the family bare by announcing the senator's ties to a brutal syndicate. Surveillance photos flash against the dark room, exposing Golden Boy Harrison shaking hands with a notorious killer. The broadcast details $20 million paid in pure blood money. It is the flawless dismantling of a proud dynasty, their narcissistic empire reduced to ash. See the tragic behavioral truth here. If you build your psychological house on the rot of dirty money, the floor will always collapse. The Whitmore legacy bleeds to death on live television, stripped of all grandiosity. The suffocating quiet of a shattered delusion hangs heavy in the air. Patricia's agonizing scream breaks it, a raw vocalization of pure denial. Harrison scrambles frantically over the floor, begging his father for the truth, but the old man just stares blankly at Dante. The trauma is absolute, as the senator's entire reality crumbles. Dante does not blink. He taps his screen, and Harrison's own recorded voice echoes horribly through the hall, begging a mob boss for murder in exchange for cash. 200 cameras flash, capturing the golden boy dropping to his knees, his ego entirely broken. We must never forget this clinical lesson. The dark company you keep in the shadows will inevitably drag you down. Never sit at the devil's table if you cannot pay the terrible psychological price of admission. The merciless cycle of consequence continues. Heavy oak doors burst open, and federal agents swarm the room, their dark gear slicing through the sea of delicate silk. The charges ring out like rifle-fire bribery, conspiracy, massive fraud. Absolute panic erupts. Victoria collapses in the madness, her expensive gown pooling like spilled milk, dark mascara tearing down her pale cheeks. Through this spinning nightmare, Dante's hand rests gently on Emma's spine, silently guiding her toward the glass doors. Their grim psychological operation is finished. Harrison feels the icy bite of steel cuffs snapping tight, forced to watch the one pure woman he loved walk away forever. Chasing empty status instead of real loyalty will leave you entirely isolated. The final moral debt of a narcissist always comes due. Harrison thrashes against the agents, his voice tearing as he screams that he loves her. Against all expectation, Emma stops dead. The behavioral silence radiating from her is deafening. Notice with me how she does not raise her voice in panic. She turns slowly, looking at the hollow shell of the man she almost married, softly murmuring that he never loved her. He only hated losing his beautiful prize. With delicate grace, she slips her arm through Dante's dark sleeve and walks out of the ruins, her chin held high. Camera flashes burst like lightning in the freezing night air. Let this be a haunting reminder to us all. Hold desperately onto those who truly stand by your side. Once a fiercely loyal heart decides it has endured enough trauma, it locks its doors for the rest of time. The heavy steel doors of the sedan slam shut, killing the glare of the flashing lights. In the dark interior, the adrenaline abandons Emma. Her delicate shoulders begin to quake, her pale hands trembling as the immense psychological gravity of their vengeance settles deep into her nervous system. Dante reaches across the leather seat, pressing his lips to her cold knuckles, a silent oath of safety that deepens her trauma bond. The Whitmore dynasty is dead, yet the night still bares its teeth. The screen of Dante's phone glows, illuminating the cold satisfaction of a megalomaniacal narcissist. Bianchi tried to flee on a private runway, but the shadows were already waiting. Emma releases a heavy breath. True courage is walking straight into the inferno, hands shaking, trusting the dark light on the other side. Follow me into the suffocating quiet of the penthouse where our clinical observation continues. The lock clicks, and Emma sheds heels, sinking into the shadows while Dante pours amber whiskey. He hands her the crystal glass, drawing her against his chest. She feels the physiological high of victory, but Dante's gaze remains anchored to his violent, paranoid world. In a low whisper, he confesses the war is far from over. Bianchi's family will never let this narcissistic insult fade. Finally, he speaks of the dark flaw from 2 years ago. The bullet Emma dug from his flesh was fired by Bianchi's assassins, punishment for Dante refusing to sell the city's soul. In a world poisoned by pathological power, choosing to keep your hands clean only paints a massive target directly on your back. The shadows in the room stretch tighter. Dante's voice drops to a grave rasp, confessing that if his heart had stopped beating on that floor, his entire criminal organization would have perished. By pressing her hands to his torn flesh, Emma saved more than a single man. She shielded hundreds of individuals resting under his dark, controlling wing. Emma stares at him, speechless, the vast psychological weight of her mercy pressing down. Dante watches her with fierce devotion, murmuring that his life debt is paid, but he found pure salvation through his subject. They crashed together in a desperate kiss, attempting to wash away the systemic terror. It is a stunning clinical truth that one act of blind kindness can mutate into deep Stockholm syndrome. But in this fatal tragedy, peace is an illusion shattered by a ringing phone. The harsh luminescence of the screen slices through the dark room. The exact millisecond the phone presses against Dante's ear, the warmth drains entirely from his rigid spine. His jaw locks into cold steel. He lowers the device slowly, and the sheer dread bleeding into his eyes makes Emma's stomach plummet. The broken man on the runway was merely a tactical decoy. The real Bianchi has melted seamlessly into the night. Worse still, their trap threw Bianchi's beloved sister into a cage. Today, you and I are going to unpack the psychological manipulation of a megalomaniac narcissist, stripped of his empire, fueled only by a sick craving for revenge. You must understand the terrible cost of facing such predators. If you swing the blade at a king, you simply cannot miss. A wounded psychopath is always far more vicious than a sleeping one. You and I can feel the chill invading the penthouse the second Emma asks who the real target is. Stick with me, this is where the psychological shift gets interesting. Dante refuses to lie. He holds her terrified gaze and drops one fatal word. You, Bianchi, is an absolute architect of ruin, knowing exactly where to plunge the knife to make his enemy bleed. Dante instantly transforms, his voice hardening into freezing iron as he barks commands for armed guards. Emma pulls her trembling knees to her chest, looking incredibly fragile on that velvet sofa. She has fought corrupt men before, but this is the breathing face of absolute death. It is a tragic lesson we all inevitably learn. When you hand another human being your whole heart, you give them the power to save you, but leave your soul entirely defenseless. Dante pulls her shaking frame against his chest, making a dark vow that sounds like a threat to God himself. He murmurs that if anyone touches her shadow, he will burn this city until the ash eclipses the sun. Psychologically, this is a terrifying, all-consuming devotion. Sleep entirely abandons them both. Emma lies awake in the pitch-black bedroom, her racing pulse matching the heavy thud of armed boots pacing the corridor. At 3 in the morning, she drifts like a ghost to the glass. Below, under the sickly yellow street lights, 3 black trucks idle ominously. It is a brutal reality we all must face. Escaping one nightmare never guarantees true peace. Sometimes, locking the door on a bad man only leaves you standing directly in the terrifying path of a hurricane. Look closely at the clinical isolation of this penthouse. For 3 days, the silence inside stretches tighter than piano wire. Down below, Emma's face burns across every news ticker. By the 4th morning, the velvet of her cage begins to choke her. She plants her feet, telling Dante she is returning to her hospital shift. He moves to block the door, but she cuts him down. Hiding, she whispers, means the monsters have already won. Never let the paralyzing fear of what might break you steal the life you are actually living. Defeated, Dante yields, quietly positioning his best shooters around the hospital. Then, exactly at 11 in the morning, the steel teeth close. A sickening crash shatters the emergency room, flooding the sterile floors with pure calculated chaos. The snare is set. The emergency room mutates into a psychological war zone. Blaring monitors and rushing nurses blur into motion, while the sharp copper smell of blood chokes the air. In the madness, a stranger in scrubs taps Emma's shoulder, murmuring that a patient in room 412 is crashing. That is the exact bed where she pulled Dante from death 2 years ago. The traumatic memory strikes her, sending her into a blind sprint. Panic has a cruel habit of blinding us to obvious traps. She never wonders how this stranger knew her name. She throws the door open to find empty sheets. A gloved hand clamps over her mouth, and a chemical-soaked rag smothers her breath. It is a brutal reality. Those who wish to destroy us will often turn our deepest compassion into the exact weapon that drags us into the dark. The harsh lights smear into a black void. Miles away, Dante answers his phone. Luca, a man built like a granite wall, sounds broken as he confesses they lost her. As an analyst, I hear the deep trauma in Luca's voice, a tragic manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. A man who grew to deeply love the very people he was once forced to fight. Dante collapses into his chair, the oxygen ripped from his lungs. His phone lights up again. The voice is smooth and sickeningly calm. Bianchi, the megalomaniac ghost. Dante issues a gravelly threat, promising a slow end if she is harmed. Bianchi only laughs, a dry, rattling sound. He whispers that she is already his. Keep this truth close to your heart. The most dangerous evil in this world rarely yells. It speaks to you softly from the darkest shadows. The line crackles with the pure psychological poison of Bianchi's laugh. He clinically mocks the tragic poetry of the moment. The sweet nurse who saved the boss is now a disposable pawn on a bloodstained board. His demands leave no room to breathe. A warehouse in Red Hook. 4 in the morning. Come alone, or Emma becomes a gruesome warning. Dante's blood turns to ice. He barks at Marco to gather the shooters, ignoring the warning that it is a suicide mission. But that is the fatal flaw of human attachment, is it not? It makes us totally blind to the steep cliff lying right in front of our feet. Just as the shouting hits a fever pitch, the oak doors swing open. His mother, Sonora Castellano, steps into the dim light. She looks exactly like a woman who has spent her whole life preparing for the end of the world. Let us examine this closely together, because this is the beating psychological heart of the tragedy. The Sonora's voice is carved from pure ice. She commands her son to stop weeping like a boy and start ruling like a king. If Emma dies, Dante survives. If Dante dies, 200 families are thrown to the wolves. We must face a horrible truth about absolute power. True responsibility often demands that we make the coldest choices imaginable. But Dante cannot unsee the memory of Emma's hands on his bleeding chest. He refuses to let her die in the dark. Yet, he is not walking blindly into the slaughter. Within an hour, they weave a brutal tactical web. Dante will march through the front doors as living imbat. Meanwhile, Enzo uses a burner phone, quietly whispering the address to the feds to spring an unseen trap. The feds have chased Bianchi's phantom shadow for months, making this anonymous whisper the tactical miracle they needed. By 3:30, silent black vans slide through the sleeping streets. Miles ahead of the convoy, we observe Emma's terrifying reality. She jolts awake into a suffocating nightmare. A single yellow bulb swings overhead. Cold metal restraints bite deeply into her wrists. A heavy iron door groans, and Salvatore Bianchi steps into the pale light. He looks like a gentle, ordinary grandfather, betrayed only by the dead. Psychopathic eyes of a man with no soul left to lose. He rips the tape from her lips, clinically whispering that no one can hear her scream in this tomb. Let this be a chilling reminder. The absolute worst monsters do not have fangs. They wear tailored suits, smile warmly, and breathe the exact same air we do. Bianchi leans close, bragging they are entirely off the grid. Emma fights the trauma tremor in her voice, warning him that Dante will tear him apart. You and I need to understand the dark psychology here. Bianchi does not merely want Dante dead. The megalomaniac wants to shatter his spirit, forcing the proud boss to beg while the woman he loves pays the price. But watch Emma's expression harden. She is done playing the helpless victim. She forces her breathing to systematically slow, her eyes analytically scanning the room. 6 armed guards, 1 steel exit. Dante once told her that when panic hits, you find a weapon. Life constantly backs us into brutal corners, but fear only blinds us to the tools lying right at our feet. Her gaze traces the dusty concrete and locks onto a jagged shard of a broken bottle. Her silent war has begun. Moving millimeter by agonizing millimeter, Emma drags the sharp glass closer to her bound hands. Suddenly, a deep vibration rattles the floor. Exactly at 4 o'clock, the heavy loading doors screech open. Dante strides into the harsh light, Marco at his heels. No heavy coats, no weapons. It takes a terrifying kind of psychological clarity to walk straight into your own execution just to save the person you love. Bianchi throws his arms wide, laughing like a twisted uncle. Dante's face is carved from absolute granite. He demands Bianchi take his life and let the girl walk free. But the sadistic old man wants to clinically drag out the pain, running a rough finger across Emma's shoulder. Real bravery is looking the devil directly in the eye and refusing to flinch. Emma sits frozen, locking her gaze with Dante, refusing to shed a single tear. The fake smile vanishes, and Bianchi shatters into a narcissistic rage. He screams with raw hatred, spitting as he recounts how Dante burned his empire to ash in a single afternoon. He violently jams the cold steel of his gun against Emma's temple, demanding Dante choose who bleeds first. Dante does not even twitch. His voice is a freezing whisper as he tells Bianchi to check the windows. The old man peers outside, and the color entirely drains from his face. The building is surrounded by the blinding headlights of Russo soldiers. Yet Bianchi sneers, claiming he will kill them both before a door breaches. Arrogance is the quiet psychological poison that ruins us all. Dante simply nods, clinically conceding that he probably could, but then he suggests Bianchi look at the ceiling. The old man slowly glances up. 2 glowing red lasers are resting directly over his beating heart. Let us examine the cognitive collapse of a megalomaniac narcissist. When Dante casually triggers his psychological trap, revealing the federal snipers above, Bianchi experiences a total psychotic break. The trapped predator reacts with blind, guttural violence, firing wildly as Dante and Marco seek shelter from the devastating crossfire. The warehouse becomes a symphony of ballistic trauma. Yet, here is a fascinating psychological truth. While the dominant males are distracted by their destructive displays of dominance, the supposedly weak victim executes her escape. Emma clinically decosaurs her restraints against shattered glass until they snap. The life lesson here is profoundly simple. True survival is rarely about making the loudest noise. It is about quiet, relentless adaptation in the shadows of chaos. Let us look closely at the behavioral shift happening here. We conceptualize trauma as a cage, but Emma uses it as an operational environment. She forces her body onto the freezing concrete, navigating a shower of ballistic shrapnel while Dante projects his panic across the room. As she drags herself through the suffocating dust, her hypervigilance detects a secondary threat moving into his blind spot. A normal civilian would freeze. Instead, she weaponizes her own body, launching herself into the hostile target and misdirecting the lethal trajectory of his weapon. It presents an essential life lesson for our clinical records. Surviving our most agonizing psychological trials requires us to willingly throw ourselves into the very darkness we are trying to escape. The hostile target recovers and lunges, but desperation fundamentally alters human biology. Emma has spent her life conditioned to heal cellular damage, not cause it. Yet, when her primary trauma bond is threatened, a primitive survival mechanism overrides her ethical programming. Without a single tremor, she lifts the firearm, pressing the cold stock to her shoulder, and executes the threat. The kinetic recoil nearly shatters her posture, but the target drops dead. His face paralyzed by shock, she simply states she saved his life. This behavioral pivot highlights a grim but deeply human life lesson. We will effortlessly dismantle our own moral architecture, crossing boundaries we swore we never would, just to preserve the attachment that keeps us tethered to reality. Dante experiences a transient stress release, but pressing his bruised forehead to hers. But Bianchi's narcissistic injury demands a final act of retribution. He raises his heavy weapon and targets the object of Dante's affection. Here, we observe the ultimate inversion of the sociopathic kingpin. Dante willingly offers his own biological mass as a shield for her, but the lethal conclusion never arrives. A federal sniper round cleanly severs Bianchi's motor function, dropping him to the concrete. Agents flood the tactical zone, physically dragging the fractured mob boss into the night. It leaves us with a stark, unavoidable life lesson. The destructive psychological violence we continuously project onto the world will inevitably mutate, returning to systematically dismantle everything we are. As the threat dissolves, Dante anchors Emma against the freezing floor, his cardiac rhythm accelerating against her chest. He checks her for trauma, but she remains in clinical dissociation, paralyzed by the psychological weight of taking a life. Cupping her pallid face, he attempts to cognitively reframe her actions, reinforcing that she acted as a protector. We routinely let pathological fear convince us of our fragility, yet her violent adaptation proves the latent resilience of the human mind. They stay anchored together until tactical teams clear the structure. Stepping into the frigid dawn, a golden sunrise bleeds over the jagged skyline. It serves as a profound life lesson. No matter the depth of our darkest psychological winter, stabilization and warmth will always predictably return. Let us examine the clinical parameters of their new sanctuary. The auditory triggers of gunfire have been replaced by the white noise of the ocean. Dante has relocated his primary attachment to a fortified stone estate, providing stability so her nervous system can achieve restorative sleep. To maintain this, he exhibits a fascinating anomaly for a megalomaniac. He permanently relinquishes his ruling position, transferring the blood-stained hierarchy to Marco. This radical divestment of control uncovers a vital life lesson. Sometimes achieving total victory over your deepest psychological battles requires knowing the exact moment to walk away. We must willingly sacrifice our toxic ego and perceived status to secure the fragile peace we have finally managed to construct in our lives. You and I must clearly define the boundaries of this new operational reality. Dante persists as the invisible architect, manipulating structural outcomes from anonymity, while leaving the overt cognitive burden to Marco. Observing the collateral degradation of their adversaries provides a textbook case of systemic collapse. Salvatore faces 25 years in federal isolation, his pathological legacy eradicated. The compromised senator faces the harsh clinical light of public impeachment, while Victoria exhibits a classic flight response, hiding in London. This fallout demonstrates a reliable behavioral life lesson. The destructive toxicity you deliberately inject into your environment will invariably rebound. It will systematically dismantle the very empire you foolishly believed you completely controlled. A subject like Emma cannot tolerate the sensory deprivation of a gilded cage. She re-enters her medical vocation, transitioning to a diurnal rhythm as a daytime nurse. The true indicator of her cognitive recovery is her nonprofit, backed by $5 million of untraceable capital. Tonight, their hypervigilance is deactivated. She sits on the porch, utilizing the thermal feedback of a teacup to ground her physiology. Dante remains in close proximity, his posture totally relaxed. She assesses the former apex predator beside her, verbalizing that her nervous system finally registers safety. It reinforces an essential life lesson. Genuine psychological healing only commences when we cease scanning our perimeter for immediate threats and finally permit ourselves to experience true stillness. Dante focuses on the horizon, vocalizing a rare moment of clinical self-awareness. He diagnoses his obsession with authority as a malignant pathology that nearly cost him his primary anchor. He admits the chronic anxiety of losing her outweighed the dopamine hit of total control. Emma leans into his physical space, casually dismantling his defenses. She informs him her brother's hostility, neutralized after deducing Dante, was the anonymous donor funding his medical education. The former kingpin tenses, disturbed his covert pro-social behavior, was detected. This delivers a vital life lesson. We construct elaborate psychological fortresses to project absolute dominance, but our true behavioral baseline is always perfectly visible to those who intimately study our daily actions. They sit processing their shared post-traumatic stress. The clinical baseline shifts as Dante initiates a painful confrontation. He admits his psychological dependency on her, yet acknowledges his environment will always carry the residue of extreme trauma. They will forever require security protocols against threats civilians never conceptualize. Eye to eye, he presents the ultimate paradox of the possessive sociopath, offering her a frictionless point of egress. If she desires a normative existence, he will detach and monitor her from afar. This highlights a profound life lesson. Authentic emotional attachment is never about holding a subject hostage inside your personal chaos. It is finding the behavioral fortitude to unlock the cage entirely, even if it permanently fractures your own mind. Emma analyzes him and permanently seals that psychological exit vector. She reminds the retired kingpin she stabilized his vital signs twice before. Their trauma bond survived too much conditioning to be severed by rational fear. Now, the clinically detached Dante Russo finally experiences an emotional override. Tears pooled in his eyes as his trembling hand extracts a small box from his coat. Inside rests his mother's platinum band, modified with a diamond. His voice wavers as he requests her permanent integration into his life. Emma provides affirmative consent. This serves as an essential life lesson. Genuine commitment requires the conscious choice to maintain proximity to another human, even when empirical logic and your basic survival instincts desperately scream at you to run away. Their union acts as retaliation against an environment that tried to terminate them. 6 months later, the coastal estate is modified for their bonding ritual. Picture the clinical perfection of white linens against the sand. The psychological irony is staggering. For a man who dominated a vast criminal network, the human variables are restricted to 50 individuals. No surveillance equipment, no politicians. The only assets present demonstrated empirical loyalty through physical sacrifice. They successfully quarantined this event from parasitic observation. This illustrates a life lesson most humans spend decades failing to comprehend. The absolute apex of human status is never coercive dominance or vast resources. It is the rare luxury of securing completely unobserved psychological peace. You and I are going to evaluate these group dynamics together. We observe a fascinating cross-section of subjects. Tyler exhibits self-soothing behaviors, picking at his cuffs. The maternal figure demonstrates emotional dysregulation, weeping prematurely. Medical personnel engage in tension-reducing laughter, unaware they are socializing with high-ranking crime operatives. Marco and Luca sit up front, displaying physical trauma as integrated identity markers, reflecting Luca's underlying Stockholm syndrome. Enzo remains hypervigilant, scanning for threats, yet the most profound psychological rupture occurs spontaneously. The maternal subject breaches the personal space of the apex predator, pulling his rigid frame into an unregulated display of affection. It proves a vital clinical truth. Lasting tribal cohesion is rarely reliant on biological genetics. It is cemented through the radical psychology of true forgiveness. The maternal subject maintains visual contact with the lethal operative, vocalizing gratitude for his role in rehabilitating her traumatized offspring. Dante closes his eyes, executing a deep inhalation that processes 2 decades of repressed trauma. For the first time since witnessing his biological caregiver's death, he vocalizes the word mother into the open air. The concentrated psychological release within that single utterance is clinically staggering. The auditory stimulus shifts, signaling Emma's entrance. She exhibits no narcissistic displays of wealth, draped merely in simple ivory fabric. Her escort experiences neurological tremors of pride as he transfers her proximity. Waiting beneath a substantial oak structure is the syndicate leader, aligned with a traditional spiritual authority. The behavioral data presents a clear diagnosis. Even the most sociopathic actors fundamentally crave the stabilizing structures of ordinary human connection. Let us examine the psychological weight of this moment. Dante speaks his vows over the crashing surf, his voice devoid of hesitation. He admits Emma pulled his mind back from the brink of collapse twice, establishing a dynamic of absolute dependency. In return, he offers to be her permanent psychological shield. When Emma responds, her voice shifts from a trauma-induced tremor into absolute steel. She promises to constantly see the fractured psyche hiding behind his terrifying persona. They exchange rings, formalizing a mutually beneficial trauma bond. You and I can take away a very simple human truth from this clinical observation. The greatest psychological anchor in our chaotic world is finding that one rare person who looks directly at your darkest impulses, understands them entirely, and still chooses to stay. Observe the scene from a psychological distance. As their lips meet under the ancient oak tree, the breathless crowd erupts, experiencing a collective emotional release. Later, under the glow of paper lanterns, Tyler raises his glass to offer a surprisingly astute behavioral observation. He notes that a healthy partnership is never about superficial perfection, but rather finding a defiant psyche willing to hold the line when real predators arrive. Much later, Emma and Dante walk beside the black water. He clinically studies the microexpressions in her eyes, asking if she feels any lingering attachment to the ghosts of her former life. There is a vital lesson here about human progression. To truly step into a functional, healthy future, we must actively allow our familiar, comfortable traumas to finally die in the dark. Emma stops at the water edge, holding his gaze with remarkable emotional regulation. She simply shakes her head, establishing a firm cognitive boundary. The only people who hold any psychological weight, she states, were the ones sitting in those wooden chairs. We should all internalize this simple mechanism. The moment you accurately identify your own emotional requirements, you stop bleeding mental energy on those who never recognized your value. Dante then admits a deeply fragile desire. He wants children, but absolutely refuses to pass down the generational trauma of the violent underworld that nearly consumed him. He plans to build a familial structure that acts as an impenetrable fortress. A slow smile alters his scarred features. He notes he will teach them to always respect medical professionals. Seeing as their mother had to pull him back from clinical death twice, Emma releases a soft laugh, resting her exhausted head against his shoulder. Her nervous system is finally returning to a calm baseline. If you and I are connecting over this case study today, please subscribe and leave a like. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of what genuine loyalty looks like. You see, Emma is not some passive victim exhibiting learned helplessness. She is living proof that those with a quiet, observant demeanor often harbor enough suppressed resilience to dismantle their darkest threats. Never misdiagnose a person as weak simply because they choose silence over noise. The most valuable life lesson here is learning to recognize the staggering psychological worth in another human being, long before they can see it in themselves. We could all benefit from cultivating that vision. This brings us to the core behavioral truth of their dynamic. This was never a fantasy about a dominant figure rescuing a helpless subject. It is empirical proof that authentic attachment does not merely extract you from your psychological wreckage. It equips you with the cognitive tools to reclaim your own autonomy. Now, I want you to analyze your own history. Did Emma's upward climb resonate with your own past? Have you ever hit rock bottom, feeling invisible, only to discover the quiet motivation to rebuild yourself? Has someone ever analyzed your ruined state and seen massive potential? Document your experiences in the comments below. We operate as a collective mind here, and your survival strategy might be exactly what stabilizes someone else tonight. Existence is difficult, but shared truth makes the psychological burden lighter. Thank you for examining the dark with me today.